How did that work for you? Make a little bit more sense? I think it's pretty straightforward and really an interesting and useful tool. If not, here are a couple of basic points about the things that we've covered. Population viability analysis is really a tool that allows us to examine whether a population will be viable at some point in the future. So if we're studying elephants, for example, a population of elephants, we might be using a PVA to estimate whether a population, given its current state, will be persistent at 100 years' time, or perhaps whether there's a greater than 95% chance that it will persist in a century, in 100 years. PVAs require some basic information. The basic PVA at a minimum requires some information about the size of the current population. It also requires some information about population growth and some variation about that population growth. Now, there's certainly more sophisticated PVAs that tack on all sorts of other variables that might influence population growth, but the basic one requires that information. PVAs have been applied to a whole variety of different species and a lot of different circumstances, but in general, as a caveat, they're really only as good as the data that go into them. And I think that's an important point to remember. So if we're concerned with our elephants, for example, our elephant population, we know that it could yield inaccurate results. So for example, if we collected data over a 10-year period on the variation in population growth rate and made our PVA from that starting from our current population forward, it's possible that those 10 years didn't incorporate all of the variability we might see in the population. So in the case of elephants, we know that they might live in a landscape that experiences a periodic drought, and those droughts might be every 20 years. Well, for a 10-year PVA based on data over 10 years, we may not, in fact, hit a year in which a drought occurred, and our population growth estimates might not, in fact, include how elephants respond to that value. So PVAs are really only as good as the data that go into them. In general, there are a couple of criteria to keep in mind. The first is really that we do need to ensure as best we can that the information that goes in, again, encapsulates all the variation we would expect to see in that population. So for elephants, a 50-year data set might be a lot better than a 10-year because it would include that drought information. Now, clearly, for those of you especially that have worked in the field, those types of data can be very costly, can be very labor-intensive, and can also be very time-consuming. So there are certainly practical constraints on this kind of, or these kinds of data. Secondly, another criteria is that the variability, the information that we're using that feeds into this PVA, we assume that the population will hold true into the future. So that information will also hold true into the future. So the way the populations behaved in the past is indicative, or we're assuming, is the way that the population will behave in the future. And that's not always the case, but it's an assumption. So as you can imagine, there might be some event, some catastrophic event, an introduced predator or an introduced pathogen or climate change or various effects that the population's never experienced in the past that occurs in the future. And that certainly can have an influence on our population growth and our judgment about viability in the long term. So PVAs, more sophisticated ones, can tack on and simulate these kinds of events occurring, but there still is some uncertainty there that needs to be considered. So if we turn to a real example, a real-world example that perhaps demonstrates this point a little bit better, consider the case of wolves, gray wolves, in Isle Royale National Park in Lake Superior. Very famous population. The wolves of Isle Royale have been studied for many decades, and it's really a great system that's yielded some fantastic science. What we know about the wolf population there is that they probably ended up, they immigrated from the mainland and reached the island in the 1950s or so. And the wolf population there has been fairly small, and there's been a great deal of effort involved in charting population growth over time, or population changes over time. So some researchers took data from the 70s, population growth data, other parameters that control growth from the 70s, and used that information to project into the future, into the 80s at that time, the viability of the population. And in reality, it resulted in some very positive values. But what happened is that the population, the real population, in fact, didn't match those estimates. In fact, they were considerably lower. The real population was considerably lower than the estimated population's estimates. And the reason for that is that about 1980 there was an outbreak of canine parvovirus, and there was also a decline in their main prey species, which really exacerbated the situation, and so wolves really crashed in the early 80s. So the PVA in this case yielded very different results than reality, and that was really a function of the data that went into it. So the bottom line here is that PVA can be a very useful tool. It has a lot of utility in terms of managing populations, but it does certainly have some limitations. So I hope in this module that you do now at this point at least know what a PVA is, the basic procedure for carrying one out, why it might be important, and perhaps more importantly, how that might relate to your own work.